Nancy, France, December 8, 1944. Rain hammers the roof of the Caserne Montfort, a grim stone barracks now serving as the headquarters of the United States Third Army. Inside, mud tracks the corridors. Dispatch riders shake water from their coats. For 3 weeks, the sky has done nothing but weep, and every man in Lieutenant General George S. Patton's command has learned to hate the sound of it. At 11 o'clock that morning, Patton picks up a telephone in his office and asks for the Third Army's chief chaplain. When Colonel James H. O'Neill answers, Patton does not waste time on pleasantries. "Do you have a good prayer for weather?" he asks. "We must do something about these rains if we are to win the war." It is an unusual request from an unusual man, delivered in the clipped, impatient tone of a commander who has run out of patience with the heavens themselves. O'Neill promises to look. He cannot find anything suitable in the standard texts, so he sits down and writes one of his own, a single paragraph asking for fair skies to fight beneath. Within a week, that scrap of prayer will be printed 250,000 times and placed in the pocket of every soldier in the Third Army. Within a month, the man who wrote it will be standing in front of Patton to receive a Bronze Star, the only medal awarded in the entire war for the writing of a prayer. It is a strange story, and on the surface a small one, tucked into the margins of a much larger battle. But it says something about how armies fight and about what a general believed he needed from his men beyond ammunition and fuel in the days before the offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. By the first week of December 1944, Patton's Third Army had ground to a halt in Lorraine, and the halt had nothing to do with the enemy. The autumn campaign through eastern France had been one of the fastest advances of the entire European war, but by late November it had bogged down, quite literally, in mud. Weeks of continuous rain had turned the roads of the region into channels of liquid clay, closer to 4 inches deep in places, according to Patton's own letters home to his wife, Beatrice. Tanks slid off tracks that had turned to soup. Supply lorries became stranded axle-deep within sight of their depots. Worse, the low gray cloud that hung over the front made flying next to impossible, and for an army that had come to depend on tactical air support to blunt German counterattacks and clear the roads ahead of its armor, that was close to catastrophic. Allied air power had been one of the decisive advantages of the campaign since Normandy. Fighter bombers strafed convoys, spotted artillery, and shattered German formations attempting to move by daylight. Take that away, and the advantage narrowed considerably. The problem was not a shortage of shells or men. Third Army in December 1944 was among the best supplied and most experienced formations in the European theater, hardened by 4 months of continuous offensive operations since breaking out of Normandy. Patton had driven his divisions from the beaches of Normandy through the liberation of Paris and across France at a pace that had startled his own superiors, and by autumn he had reached the fortified approaches of the Metz region, a set of 19th-century forts that had never previously fallen to direct assault. Even against that formidable defensive network, the advance had continued, if slowly, and Patton's staff had every reason to expect the pattern to hold. Instead, the campaign stalled not because of German resistance, but because the ground itself had turned against them. Reconnaissance patrols reported roads that had simply ceased to exist as passable surfaces, swallowed beneath standing water and churned earth. Engineers worked around the clock laying corduroy roads of felled timber to give tracked and wheeled vehicles any purchase at all, and even then convoys were routinely reported stuck for hours within sight of their destinations. The problem was a sky that refused to clear, and there was no ordnance factory, no supply depot, and no tactical manual that could produce good weather. It was, in the truest sense, beyond the reach of anything the United States Army could manufacture or requisition. For a commander as forceful and as superstitious as Patton, that kind of powerlessness appears to have been intolerable. He had built a reputation, deserved or not, on momentum, on the idea that hesitation killed more soldiers than boldness did. A stalled army, mired to the axles and grounded by fog, was a contradiction of everything he believed about how wars were won. Something had to change, and if it could not be forced through artillery or maneuver, Patton seems to have decided it would have to be asked for more incredible true stories from World War II, carefully researched and brought to life, subscribe to the channel, and never miss a new documentary. Patton was, by most accounts of those who served closely with him, a genuinely devout man, if an unconventional one. He believed, according to his own later writings and the recollections of his family, that he had lived before as a soldier in earlier ages, and he treated prayer less as private comfort than as another tool of command, to be organized and issued like rations. When he telephoned O'Neill that December morning, he was not asking for spiritual guidance for himself. He was asking his chief chaplain to produce something that could be distributed to an entire army, the way one might requisition boots or ammunition. O'Neill, a 52-year-old priest who had served as Third Army's senior chaplain since its formation, searched the available prayer books and found nothing that fit the specific, almost tactical request Patton had made. So he wrote his own. The text he produced was brief, only a single paragraph, asking that the immoderate rains be restrained and that fair weather be granted for battle, so that the army might advance from victory to victory. O'Neill brought the card to Patton personally. The general read it, approved, and gave an order that was startling in its scale for something so small. Have 250,000 copies printed, he said, and see that every man in the Third Army gets one. The logistics of that order fell to O'Neill and his staff of chaplains, working with whatever printing capacity Third Army's rear echelon could spare in the middle of an active campaign. Reproducing 250,000 cards in a matter of days, in a headquarters built for waging war rather than running a print shop, required commandeering presses, paper stock, and manpower that would ordinarily have gone to maps, orders, and propaganda leaflets. The Third Army's chaplaincy itself was a substantial organization by this stage of the war, numbering nearly 500 ordained ministers, priests, and rabbis spread across more than 20 divisions, each responsible for the spiritual welfare of thousands of men under near-constant strain. O'Neill, as chief chaplain, sat above this entire structure, and it was through his network of divisional and regimental chaplains that the cards would ultimately be distributed to individual soldiers, alongside mail, rations, and ammunition resupply, absorbed into the ordinary rhythm of Army logistics as though it were any other item on a quartermaster's list. The cards themselves were small, pocket-sized, printed on plain cardstock, intended to survive in a breast pocket or a pack rather than sit on a shelf. On the reverse of many copies, O'Neill added a Christmas greeting from Patton to his men, a small human touch amid the machinery of an army preparing to fight through the worst weather of the year. It was not a weapon in any conventional sense, but Patton treated its distribution with the same seriousness he gave to fuel convoys and ammunition trains, because he had convinced himself, and was determined to convince his men, that it mattered just as much. Whatever printing press absorbed the order would have done so at the expense of other paperwork. A headquarters running an active campaign does not have unlimited spare capacity, and the diversion of resources toward 250,000 copies of a single paragraph is itself a measure of how seriously Patton meant the order to be taken. The prayer cards reached the Third Army's roughly 486 chaplains and their units in the second week of December, distributed down through more than 20 divisions alongside a directive, issued in Patton's name, urging soldiers to pray wherever they found themselves. Pray when driving, it read. Pray when fighting. Pray alone. Pray with others. Pray for the cessation of these immoderate rains. Pray for victory. By December 14, 1944, the last of the 250,000 cards had been handed out. 2 days later, on December 16th, Hitler launched the offensive that would become the Battle of the Bulge, a surprise assault by more than 200,000 German troops through the Ardennes forest, catching the Allied line badly off guard and threatening to split the American and British armies in two. Patton's Third Army was ordered to disengage from its own operations in Lorraine, pivot 90 degrees and drive north to relieve the besieged town of Bastogne, a maneuver that has since been studied as one of the most demanding logistical feats of the entire war. And then, within days of the offensive beginning, the weather changed. The cloud that had grounded Allied aircraft for weeks broke, the skies cleared, and fighter bombers were able to fly again, hammering German columns strung out along the roads of the Ardennes and providing the close air support that helped blunt the German advance. Whether the clearing skies owed anything at all to O'Neill's prayer is not something history can settle, and honest accounts of the episode do not pretend otherwise. December weather in that region was always liable to break, and meteorologists have offered entirely secular explanations for the shift. What can be said with more confidence is the effect the timing had on the men who had been carrying that small card in their pockets for barely a fortnight. To soldiers freezing in foxholes, watching contrails streak overhead again after weeks of empty gray sky, the coincidence felt like something closer to an answer. If you are finding this story interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there is plenty more like it still to come. Patton's decision to weaponize, in effect, an appeal to Providence was not without precedent in other armies, though the form it took in Third Army was distinctly his own. German commanders of the period, operating within a regime that had deliberately marginalized organized Christianity in favor of secular ideology and its own invented mythology, made little comparable use of religious appeal at an institutional level. Wehrmacht belt buckles famously carried the phrase Gott mit uns, God with us, but this was an inherited imperial motto rather than an active program of command-directed prayer, and German army chaplains operated under far greater official suspicion than their American counterparts. Their numbers steadily reduced as the war went on, and the regime's hostility to organized religion hardened. There was no equivalent on the German side of the Ardennes front that December of a field marshal ordering hundreds of thousands of printed prayers distributed to his freezing troops. If anything, the Wehrmacht's own commanders were placing their faith in fuel reserves that did not exist, and a captured American depot at Stavelot that never fell into their hands as planned, a rather more conventional kind of wishful thinking. British and Commonwealth forces, by contrast, maintained a robust and well-established chaplaincy tradition, and days of prayer were periodically called for by national leaders, most famously around the Dunkirk evacuation in 1940, when King George VI called for a national day of prayer as the British Expeditionary Force awaited evacuation from the beaches. But these were civilian and ecclesiastical initiatives, coordinated through church and state, rather than the direct order of a single field commander to his troops in the middle of an active campaign. What made Patton's weather prayer distinctive was its scale and its source. Not a bishop, not a president, but the general himself, treating morale and faith as logistics problems to be solved with the same directness he applied to fuel and ammunition. Other American commanders certainly valued their chaplains and encouraged religious observance among their men, and figures such as Dwight Eisenhower were known to attend services regularly and speak of the war in explicitly moral terms. But few, if any, matched the specific, almost theatrical precision of ordering 250,000 printed prayers distributed on a fixed timetable ahead of a named campaign, timed almost like an artillery barrage. It is difficult to find a clean parallel anywhere else in the Second World War for a general. Treating a prayer card as a piece of materiel, manufactured and issued with a deadline attached, and it is that specificity, more than the prayer's content, which has made the episode endure in military memory long after most administrative footnotes of the campaign have been forgotten. For more incredible true stories from World War II, carefully researched and brought to life, subscribe to the channel and never miss a new documentary. The episode's afterlife has outlasted almost everything else about that difficult December. O'Neill himself survived the war and later wrote his own account of the prayer's origins, published some years afterwards, which remains the primary source for most of what is known about the episode, including the wording of Patton's initial telephone call and his later remarks upon awarding the medal. As with any recollection set down after the fact, historians treat the precise wording as O'Neill's best recollection rather than a verbatim transcript, though the broad sequence of events is well corroborated. Patton summoned O'Neill to his headquarters not long after the skies cleared, and Bastogne was relieved, reportedly greeting him by declaring that O'Neill's prayer had proved remarkably effective and that he wanted to pin a medal on him personally. When O'Neill arrived, Patton told him he was the most popular man at headquarters, that he stood in good standing with both the Lord and the soldiers, and pinned the Bronze Star to his chest, an award ordinarily reserved for heroic or meritorious achievement in combat, here given for the drafting of a single paragraph. It remains, so far as researchers of the period have been able to establish, the only medal awarded during the entire Second World War specifically for the writing of a prayer. Surviving copies of the original card are held today in several American military archives and museum collections, including institutions dedicated to the history of the Battle of the Bulge and the National World War II Museum, and reproductions of the text continue to circulate in military chaplaincy circles as an example of faith deployed, quite literally, as a tool of leadership. Copies have surfaced periodically at militaria auctions and in veterans' family collections in the decades since, each one a small paper survivor of a much larger and much colder story. Whether the story reflects genuine providence, coincidence, or simply a shrewd general's understanding of what his exhausted, freezing men needed to hear in the depths of a brutal winter campaign, is a judgment history leaves open, and honest tellings of the episode resist the temptation to declare it settled either way. What is not in dispute is that Patton believed it mattered enough to have it printed 250,000 times, and that he believed it mattered enough to personally decorate the man who wrote it in front of his own staff, at a headquarters otherwise consumed by the business of an army still fighting for its life in the Ardennes snow. Return for a moment to that office in Nancy, the rain still falling outside, the general on the telephone asking his chaplain for something no supply depot could provide. It is easy, looking back from a distance of 8 decades, to treat the weather prayer as a curiosity, a footnote to the vast machinery of the Ardennes campaign, dwarfed by the tank battles and the frozen dead of Bastogne. But it reveals something the battle reports do not. A commander who understood that armies do not run on fuel and ammunition alone, and who was prepared to marshal faith itself with the same discipline he applied to a tank column, ordering it printed, distributed, and delivered on schedule like any other piece of equipment his men might need to survive the winter. The rains did clear. The aircraft did fly again. Bastogne was relieved, and Third Army's pivot north into the Ardennes is remembered as one of the most remarkable feats of generalship of the war. O'Neill's small paragraph cannot be credited with any of that, not by any honest reckoning of the meteorology or the fighting, and no historian would claim otherwise. The clearing skies of mid-December 1944 have a perfectly ordinary meteorological explanation, and armies far less devout than Patton's have won battles in far worse weather without the benefit of a printed prayer in every pocket. But for the men who carried that card through the coldest winter of their lives, through the fog and the mud, and then, finally, through the clearing sky, it was proof of something larger than a coincidence of weather. A general had gone looking for an edge he could not manufacture, and the only man who could give it to him was a chaplain with a pen and a blank card. Patton pinned a medal on him for it, not because a paragraph had won a battle, but because he believed in his own way that it had given his soldiers something to hold on to when nothing else in that gray, drowning December could. It is worth remembering, too, what kind of army this was. Hardened, exhausted, driven relentlessly by a commander who had little patience for weakness and even less for excuses, and yet capable in the space of a single telephone call of treating a chaplain's paragraph as seriously as a resupply order. That contradiction is, in its own way, the truest measure of the man who gave it. The rain stopped. The skies cleared. And somewhere in the pocket of nearly every man in the Third Army, a small printed card kept asking for exactly that, carried into the coldest, bloodiest weeks of the war by soldiers who had been given, if nothing else, something to believe in.